And before we get started, another thing to thank you so much to our panelists for presenting today. We have 4 different panelists, and I'm so excited about this session, and we're going to dive more into feminist economics. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. With us today, we have Stephan, sorry, I knew I was going to mess up, Stephan Lefebvre, as well as Lisa Giddings. Stephan is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Bucknell University. He earned his PhD from American University in 2020, and his research is in stratification economics and Latinx communities in the US economy. Lisa Giddings is an associate professor of economics at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Her research and teaching interests are in the fields of gender and the labor market, the family and GLBT economics, women in sports, feminist pedagogy, and economics. Her latest publications include the chapter Gender Division of Labor Among Couples in the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Economics, which is co-edited by our other 2 panelists today. She also has Elder Care and Paid Work in the European Social Policy, and Women in the Field and Money in the Bank. And that is published in 9, a Journal of Baseball History and Culture. She's been very excited to have been able to participate in the AAA Educate workshop and continue collaboration with Stephan Lefebvre at Bucknell University. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our 2 presenters. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Iris, for that great introduction. Let me see if I can figure out how to share my slides here. I'm not quite sure what the best way to do this is, but let me, oops, that's not what I want to do. I want to present. Okay, how does this look for folks?
Looks great.
Good? Okay,
Looks
great.
Good.
I have the chat window open, and I'll be running slides for Lisa as well, so bear with me. But our talk is feminist pedagogy in economics, and specifically teaching the minimum wage in principles of economics. So big picture is we're interested in feminist pedagogy. We're going to talk to you about a module that we created and implemented just a couple of weeks ago. So we did this in the fall of this year. And we're going to tell you how it went and some of our findings. And we do want this to be an open conversation. So if you have feedback or questions, feel free to put it in the chat. And if it's organic and we can address it then, great. And if not, there's going to be a question and answer period at the end. How do I advance slides? Okay, by way of introductions, I think that we already got across who we are. This project started, came out of, I met Lisa at the Educate workshop, which was run in January of this year. It was on pedagogy and DEI initiatives. But speaking for myself, I would say that I was a little bit disappointed with how issues of gender and race were actually dealt with in the workshop. In the workshop, I guess the main takeaway was that good pedagogy is good pedagogy. Bad pedagogy disproportionately impacts women and people of color and underrepresented folks in economic work. We explicit explicit effect. Lisa sort of in feminist and economic. I discovered that folks at Bucknell had been working on the 90s, but this has a very thin literature and it has continued very long. That's part of what we're doing here. We're trying to pick it up and dust it off a little bit and read with folks who are doing this or are doing this work, but we don't see it really in the literature as much. Lisa, anything about, you want to jump in here with your motivations for this project?
Well, I think I echo Stephen's concerns about the Educate workshop. It was fantastic, and there was a lot of really great teaching ideas, but I think you're right, exactly. It was, better teaching helps everyone, kind of, it's sort of like the, economy lifts all boats kind of metaphor there. And so I think my interest was they encouraged us to try to pick, a topic. And what was really fun is that Stephan and I were both interested in the minimum wage. And so, it was fortuitous now that David Card won the award. So it really fits in well for an introductory class and thinking about revamping it with explicit feminist pedagogy in mind. So that was sort of the background about why we chose minimum wage.
Yeah, so I got a note that my Zoom is going in and out a bit. Maybe, so let me turn off my camera then, and I'll see if that helps the situation.
It's working well so
I'll
far.
try that out for a little bit. You can give me feedback if it's not working. The plan for the talk, we're going to talk in two main sections. One section is we're going to tell you about models for thinking about teaching and pedagogy. This grounds the way that we think about our module, and we think it's important for us as faculty to learn more about these things, learn more about different epistemological positions that students can be in, and different conceptions of feminist pedagogy outside of economics to hopefully inform our approaches. So after we talk about those models, we'll then spend the bulk of our time talking about our actual minimum wage module. So I have here the cover of this book, Valuing Us All, Feminist Pedagogy and Economics. It's one of the few texts that covers this. So highly recommend that, right? And I'm happy to share slides at the end of this. The most familiar frameworks for thinking about teaching and learning in college, I would say, are Bloom's taxonomy. That one is the one that likely your teaching and learning center introduce you to when you first get to a university out of a PhD program. Maybe one level up from that is William Perry's framework for thinking about intellectual development. So I'll start there because it's maybe a little bit less familiar for folks. But William Perry developed this in the 1960s, working at Harvard, interviewing largely Harvard undergraduate men, some women in his sample, but largely men. And his final study was just based on the male interviews. He later on said, well, the handful of women that we looked at seemed to fit into our model. So I guess it's translates, and he kind of left it at that. That was the extent of it. He conceives of individuals moving through various positions, starting with dualism, which he characterizes as an understanding of there's a right way and a wrong way. There are facts, and students then are coming into the classroom, opening their ears and listening out for what is the right way to think about this. What is the right framework? What are the right procedures? How do I solve this problem, etc. Multiplicity is the next position. And he doesn't think that people move through these sequentially necessarily. Instead, the positions are higher in that they encapsulate the previous position. Someone in multiplicity can understand the thinking of someone in dualism, but someone in dualism has a really hard time thinking about how you would think about this topic in a multiplicity or relativism or commitment way. So that's the relationship between these positions. Each higher level subsumes the one before it. So multiplicity is, maybe you are familiar with this, maybe this resonates with you in terms of your classroom. Students understand there's a variety of ways to think about something, and everyone is entitled to their own opinion, right? It's very difficult to adjudicate claims, but there's different ways that we can look at this topic. Relativism is the next position, and this is when you start to understand not just arguments, not just opinions, right? But you start to make that connection between empirics or supporting evidence and arguments, right? Students want to start developing their own arguments, and that's the last stage of commitment, right? Relativism is, I understand these different positions and different potential arguments within them. Commitment is an ethical move, an ethical and moral and intellectual last step where students say, I understand all of these different positions and all of the different evidence, in what I believe is X. I believe that the true, or for me, my contingent way of thinking about this is a little bit of from this and a little bit from that idea, right? They're constructing their own knowledge. They understand that knowledge is constructed and they're making a commitment to a perspective. A third approach, which is not yet within feminism, right? But a third approach that we argue could enable feminist approaches in pedagogy is that of think, right? Think, instead of thinking about knowledge acquisition as acquiring facts and ways to put those facts together, right? Analysis and employing those facts in context. Think understands learning as any change that happens in the student. So Think's alternative taxonomy of learning includes things like the human dimension, caring, and learning how to learn. And all of these three changes that we can have in our students, which he views as part of learning, we think are connected to or can help us bring in feminist principles and feminist values into the classroom. So suddenly, when in my class, when I'm trying to think about and I'm trying to get students on board with, okay, we're doing an alternative pedagogy here, I say this is part of Think's caring, right? If you think, oh, we already read this article, we already analyzed it, why do I have to write about my own opinion? You know, that's not going to be on an exam. If you ask me my opinion, I'm going to give you my opinion, but that's not going to be a right or wrong answer on the exam. So why should I care about this? You know, why should I be learning? And we say, okay, learning isn't just about getting right answers on the exam. Learning is helping you build a relationship with this knowledge, helping you build a relationship with this knowledge either through your caring or your understanding of how this affects other people or yourself. All of these different dimensions of learning. These kind of foundational frameworks can all be put through various feminist lenses, right? So in search of feminist pedagogies for Lisa and myself doesn't mean there's one true feminist approach that we should all do, and certainly not one that I own, right? But we're trying to inform our pedagogy with these approaches. So one of the earliest examples is this book, Women's Ways of Knowing, and the related literature to this book, which is very large and voluminous. But this book, written by these three authors that we see below, this book critiques Perry's framework of cognitive development, of moving from dualism to multiplicity to relativism to commitment. And through interviews with women, these authors developed a different hierarchy, right? The hierarchy starts with silence. Silence is these are all positions that students enter the classroom with and potentially inhabiting. So to give you an idea, silence in their book is described as a student saying in an interview, I could never understand what they were talking about. My schooling was very limited. I didn't learn anything. I would just sit there and let people ramble about something I didn't understand. And I would say, yup, 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 not understanding. Not able to start that journey of understanding and cooperating or involving themselves in the learning, right? Not yet there, because of many structural factors. Other epistemological perspectives that students could have, and these, again, are not necessarily things that people move through in a linear way, but someone can exist in a received knowledge position in one area of their life and a procedural knowledge in another area. But so to give you an idea, received knowledge is a perspective from which women conceive of themselves as capable of receiving and even producing knowledge. Subjective knowledge is a perspective where truth and knowledge are conceived of as personal, private, or subjectively intuited, right? So this is, you tell me what the economic model says, I'll spit that back out for an exam, received knowledge. Subjective knowledge is when I go to the store, I'm going to ignore everything my economics professor said and do my own thing. Procedural knowledge is a position in which women are invested in learning and applying objective procedures for obtaining and communicating knowledge. And constructed knowledge is this integrating of the voices. You found your own voice, you're able to put together different perspectives and their legitimating claims or their arguments, their supporting evidence. And you have a contingent or working conceptions of how the world works around you. In economics, there have only been a handful, really a handful. I have a full bibliography of works in feminist pedagogy and economics, and it's very short, but I'm excited to talk to folks if they know of things that I haven't read. But there's only a handful of serious attempts to really wrangle with these epistemologies of learning and feminist approaches. I'm going to talk about two of them. The first is from this co-authored work, Toward Feminist Pedagogy and Economics. And this work proposes 4 phases of course content. The first being teaching the received neoclassical canon, teaching Econ 101 as it is in Manicure or Krugman. Second is finding and adding members of heretofore underrepresented groups. So adding in an article about X, talking about women when you talk about paid family leave. Third is changing core concepts and proposing alternatives. So this is alternative models. We can have alternative models for the same event, right? So I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about models of discrimination or models of occupational crowding. All of that trying to understand the same event. And the fourth is redefining and reconstructing economics to include us all. And for me personally, what that means is if I describe my class to a mainstream economist, they would say to me, that's not economics. Once I've achieved that, if someone says, I don't think you're even teaching economics, I can say, great, I have transformed this sufficiently or up to a level where I've moved on from the stuff that you're doing. This is Jean Shackelford's chapter, right, which is the second chapter in Valuing Us All. But she lays out some principles, some grounding feminist principles for grounding feminist pedagogy. And so this is things that you could think of as, how am I doing this in the classroom, right? So she grounds feminist pedagogy in feminist theory. And the 3 pillars that she brings out, the 3 threads that she brings out from feminist theory is an explicit goal of ending patriarchy and oppression. That means that I spent a class talking about what is feminism, explaining to my students what it means to explicitly talk about feminism in the classroom. Do you think that you have a feminist instructor? Great. Did they explicitly talk about feminism in the classroom? What physical, visible things can we see in the classroom? So second is valuation of forms of knowing other than objective, hierarchical, and authority-laden models. That means that sage on a stage has to go. We cannot just stand in the front of the classroom and just talk the entire time. And third is a focus on practice with an emphasis on process over content, process over product and content. So to give you an idea here, I asked my students to talk about what feminism would look like in the classroom. And one student told me, well, do I just have to talk about the classroom or can I talk about things outside of the classroom as well? And I was like, that is exactly the point. Yes. Yeah, Okay, so with those frameworks in mind, this is how Lisa and I were thinking about it. We can talk about the specifics of our minimum wage module. So it was spread over 4 days, about 2 weeks. We started with the simple supply and demand for labor model. So this is, we covered, as we all do in principle, if you teach principles of economics, you spend a couple classes, a couple weeks doing supply and demand. I judiciously avoided supply and demand for labor. I did apples and donuts and pizza and all of my favorite things. But on this day, I said, what if we do supply and demand for labor? Now the vertical axis is wages, not price, and Q is quantity of labor, hours or people. So that was the first day is, can you apply a price floor to this concept? And they could, they understand a surplus of labor means unemployment. The second day is thinking about the minimum wage as an institution, how it's run in the US. The third day is empirics meets theory. So introducing, and this is rarely done in Econ 101, but saying, okay, we have this theory. how do we test the implications of the model? The model has a very strict prediction. Does the real world match that? How do we do that? Use the scientific method, which they learned in elementary school or middle school, as a model. You could think about that, right? And the fourth day is multiple perspectives, right? Trying to allow students choice in what they read, choice in what they talk about, and building towards this question of ultimately, what do you think will happen if the minimum wage is raised?
All right, so I'll come in. We're going to start. Stephan and I are going to take turns and talk about different days that we did and how it turned out. So I'm going to start with that first day where we introduced our models and introduced what we're calling multiple voices, multiple models. So like Stephan said, I introduced this standard principles of economics textbooks model of the minimum wage. And at this point in my class, students have seen price ceilings and price floors, so they have an idea. Like you said, we introduced, the labor market for the first time. And I included two little pictures here. The one on the right, the quick review, is the only mention in the Krugman textbook, arguably one of the more, open textbooks that exist. And this is literally the only thing that's mentioned about the minimum wage. Again, just basically reiterates the standard neoclassical model. And then this little picture is from the Marginal Revolution University class on microeconomics. Again, just a really standard presentation that if you introduce the minimum wage, the standard model says we're going to reduce employment and increase unemployment. Okay, so again, these standard presentations don't address any conflicting empirical results, even though the Marginal Revolution University does talk about this a little bit. They don't go into trying to explain this much at all. So again, what we're trying to do here is, get past that dual thinking, recognize conflicting evidence, and help students learn how to filter through and be able to filter through evidence and filter through all of the information that can be presented about the minimum wage and learn to make their own opinion about this. So in addition to the neoclassical model, I introduced other questions. First of all, how is the labor different than the market for donuts, for example? So we have discussions, some of the things are really obvious, right? I can buy one donut at a time, or I can supply one donut. It's very hard to supply 1 or 2 hours of work if you're in the labor market. People aren't cogs. There's power relationships between the employers and employees. So we introduced a political economy model that considers exploitation in the labor market, for example. Perhaps there's discrimination, et cetera. So I introduced other models and had students sort of thinking about, whether or not really we can think about labor in a competitive sense in the way we do apples. So that was my first day. Stephan, you can take over.
Great. So I have a slide here on the readings that I used in my class. So on day 2, we focus on institutional details. So they read government reports on how the minimum wage is administered. There we go. And also who fights for the minimum wage? How did we get a minimum wage? On day 3, empirics versus theory, a CEPR paper by John Schmidt that has a great literature review of empirical research on the minimum wage. And also it has in about 3 to 4 pages alternatives to the mainstream model. It has a list of 13 different alternatives. So students could literally fill in the blank. The mainstream model predicts unemployment will increase. An alternative is blank. An alternative is lower profits. An alternative is wage compression. An alternative is lower hours, but higher take-home pay. An alternative is all of these different, and suddenly students were like, oh, wow, we didn't think of that. These were all held constant or assumed away or, not dealt with in the simple model. The fourth day, like I said, is choose your own adventure. So choose some of the following. I have different perspectives here. The center right from The Economist, anonymous article, conservative view, right? But all of these I've linked to learning outcomes using Fink's framework, right? So thinking about foundational knowledge and application, and that's where most Econ 101 and frankly, most economics classrooms end. Foundational knowledge and application. Do you know the basics and can you apply it to different problems to solve problems? Here, I'm also saying learning how to learn, right? What is the relationship between living wage campaigns, union organizing? They read this article on employee relations, a labor history article, and they had to figure out how to make sense of it, right? That is different genres. My takeaways from this are you have to use more than at least 2 contrasting non-academic readings so students can consider and see examples of evidence and arguments ultimately to help them develop their own perspective. I say non-academic readings because they are used to academics debating things, and this falls into the multiplicity framework that they have. They said, okay, everyone is open to their own opinion. You know, some academics believe this, some believe that. Okay, great. Right? If you find non-academic readings like Michael Strain's here, congressional testimony from AEI, a conservative economist, when they say, well, his argument seemed a little weak. I said, because do you think that he wasn't trying hard? You know, he's an AEI conservative economist doing congressional testimony. This is the best they got. You know, this is not an academic exercise. This is real world people arguing for things, trying to affect change in the real world. This also allows me to include women and people of color as authors and as subjects. Okay.
All right, so this exercise, this was day 2 for me, and I created this exercise with several goals in mind. So first of all, our department has a initiative in which we're trying to get students to understand, use, and be able to interpret empirical evidence and data, be able to try to start to generate arguments based on evidence, etc. So, and in combination, my goal here was also to add the Fink learning outcomes, where I want students how to learn, start to see themselves in the data, and also the human dimension, where they recognize how a particular policy might affect other people. All right, so what I did here, and in just a second, Stephan, if you could click on that public Tableau dashboard, that'd be great. So what I did is I created this dashboard for students, and it's really curated information based on BLS data, where students don't have to really know much about, they didn't have to learn a package, they don't have to learn R. And what they can do is mess around, essentially, have fun with this kind of presentation of data. And I wanted them to get a story. So hold on, it's a little tricky. So only maybe just put gender, just click gender and not age there. Okay. So what it does is students can decide what categories they want to look at. And it presents data in one of 2 ways. You can get earnings by group or group by earnings, the other way around. So here we have gender by earnings at or below the minimum wage. So we've got percent of workers there. You can kind of see whether men versus women. Okay, so it looks just kind of easily, you can see women are more of the people that earn the minimum wage. Maybe can you take off gender and put, I think it was kind of fun. I have lots of things here, but I think they look at the electoral map there. Okay, okay. So again, this is percent of workers. Maybe click on the blue thing. Click here to get earnings by group. Okay, I think that's a little bit better. It switched you to race though. Yeah, so take off race, yeah. Okay. So again, you can kind of see students were just able to mess around in the same way that we're messing around here. So the first thing to note about this, if you just glance at this information, is you can see that the percentage of people workers in the American workforce that earn the minimum wage is tiny. So students recognize that sort of immediately. You know, I think a lot of times people come into class thinking, you know, 50% of the workforce earns the minimum wage, but it's really very, very small. But then this exercise allows students to sort of explore different categories. You can see here, oh, blue states have fewer workers at or below the minimum wage. Let's try one more, Stephan, maybe just go by race. Okay. And again, they can explore this. They can see, well, African-American people tend to be more likely to earn the minimum wage. You know, I have them explore 3 or 4 of these in groups, and you know they have almost an entire class period, about 45 minutes, to explore and create a story for themselves that helps them understand who earns the minimum wage. They're working together. They're asking questions together, and then if you could close this out and go back to our okay. So then in the end, I have them devise a question about the minimum wage that they can't answer with the data. You know, if so, what is that question? What kind of information would you need? So I found this to be a really interactive cooperative learning exercise where students are able to recognize themselves and other people in the policy. It grounds it. It's definitely part of one of the DEI goals, where disaggregating data rather than just seeing, the minimum wage as a whole. Disaggregating data helps students recognize that it affects real people.
I think that's great. And I think disaggregating data and also they're doing a lot of the disaggregation choices. I mean, we have to present the data, we have to clean up the data for them, but I think that's great for also this empowerment stuff and voice stuff. Similarly, institutional details, right? We want to have context-rich lessons, but where is that context coming from? If the context is coming from students and the things that they are familiar with, that's one thing, but it's difficult we can't then have one example. We have to let students write about or analyze something that they're familiar with. The alternative is give them the context. Help them also learn how to find that context themselves. So questions that I asked in a jigsaw format were things like, who is covered in the minimum wage? How is the minimum wage enforced? So that also had a fun side benefit of saying, you could work for the federal government. You could help enforce these laws. Let me tell you about the wage and hour division. Let me tell you about how the investigators put together information to bring forth cases, win back money for people who were illegally paid under the minimum. I think that's all I want to say at this point.
All right, so the next thing that I focused on was really cooperative learning in the unit. So again, following sort of a feminist pedagogy notion is to make my classroom more of a community and much less hierarchical, right? So cooperative learning really is using small groups to enhancing learning outcomes. I take away the power, take away the sage from the stage. The environment is not individualized, it's not competitive, and students are actively engaged with each other to produce knowledge. So I had a couple of exercises. Again, I think one of the things we'll talk about toward the end of this little talk is, really that we slowed down. And it might sound shocking, but I spent 4 days, 4 entire lectures talking about this one topic. And it was fascinating, to be able to slow down and really have students dig into very small issues and really understand different theoretical models, et cetera. It allowed a lot more space in the classroom. I wish that we could do that for, many topics just to get through stuff. I'm definitely sacrificing some topics at the end, but okay. So I had 2 cooperative learning exercises that I thought went really well. So one was a think, pair, share. So what I have my students do is go out in the real world and they're just trying to understand this concept of whether or not a price ceiling or a price floor is binding. So I have them just go gather some anecdotal evidence to try to decide whether the current federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour is binding. And I have them think about, well, what would be evidence? What they have to think ahead of time, how could I even show that, right? So they think about whether or not, what is a skilled worker? What's a skill? You know, does a teenager with a lifeguarding, class, are they skilled? Should they earn more than the minimum wage, etc.? You know, if your kid brother can get $15 an hour by mowing lawns, what does that imply about the minimum wage? So have them really think about that and then go out and gather evidence. Sometimes I'll provide my own evidence, like a picture of a Quick Trip ad and that I saw in the bathroom offering a job for $15 an hour, etc. And so they do this ahead of time. That's their ticket to ride. And then they come and they share their evidence in class and with each other in small groups. And then they can make a decision collectively. They can decide whether or not particular evidence is good. In 1 second, I'll show you a couple of the examples of this. And then in the second cooperative activity, I had a send a problem. And so this is where I have students really considering this conflictive evidence about the minimum wage. So we've got Card and Kruger saying there's almost no employment effects. And how can that resonate when the standard model shows that there's going to be decreased employment and increased unemployment? So in this particular activity, I had students divide into groups and they are given problems in envelopes. And I have them think about demand and supply models of the labor market, where we've got inelastic demand, inelastic supply, elastic demand, and elastic supply, for example. They draw that out. They're still struggling with what that means. How do they relate slope and elasticity? And then I have them incorporate a minimum wage and show what that effect is. How does that look like? It's different if you have a pretty inelastic demand. How is that different than the standard model's predictions? And then I have students exchange their work to see different elasticities. So again, they're really trying to put together in practice, the understanding of models and then sharing different insights. Stephan, if you could go one more ahead, that'd be great. So this was an example of that think, pair, share. This is how one student, all the students had to do once they were in groups and sharing is then write up a little paragraph that they learned from each other. And I thought this was an interesting example because what they're doing here, they say, for example, jobs that are in an area where there is a higher demand for workers, the wage tends to be higher than the minimum wage. Brianna mentioned that in her hometown, people were making wages at the minimum because the larger city called for a greater demand for jobs. So, I mean, you can see they're kind of struggling through this, but they're talking with each other. That looks like a misunderstanding to me, but they are recognizing, in different areas, you can imagine some differences, different responses to the minimum wage. So I thought this was a really good example.
So my last contribution here, I'm going to go through quickly because I know we're butting up against time. But so Perry has this idea of moving from dualism to commitment. I see evidence of dualism in my, oh boy, how do I go back? 1 second, sorry. Okay, I see evidence of dualism, dualist thinking with my students, and I also see evidence of this importance of voice. So I'll just focus on the importance of voice, which is something that the Women's Ways of Knowing book and way of thinking brings out, right? They emphasize, one of the ways of expressing this is emphasizing the difference between, say, a masculine assertion of I have the right to my opinion versus a more modest, inoffensive, it's just my opinion, right? So Perry talks about multiplicity as like, oh, there's lots of opinions out there, but that can mean different things through a gendered lens. So here I have 2 examples in the bottom right from my students when I asked them what's going to be the likely effects of the minimum wage. And they wrote a whole essay, but this is just 2 excerpts. Like I had a response from a female student. From my perspective, I believe economists will only make predictions, and when it comes to making decisions, politicians should do what they think is best, right? And a different response from a male student. Personally, I side with those who want to increase it. I believe that making it too high will be detrimental to society, but moderately increasing it will not do any harm. Women's Ways of Knowing prompts us to think about how gender and culture affect how students move from gathering foundational knowledge, even discarding dualist thinking, but how exactly they reach to that and what their commitment looks like can be very different. Last thing I'll say is something that's common between Perry and women's ways of knowing, though, is this phenomenology of the classroom. So thinking about, and that kind of brings us to some of our lasting conclusions, thinking about the phenomenology of the classroom. What I mean is, when you're asking students questions, acting like you are listening, acting like you care about what they're saying, is different from listening, is different from caring about what they're saying, right? So this question of, can we make a feminist module on the minimum wage, or is this more about having a feminist classroom? I think some of the responses that I got from students is because I've engaged with them many times over the course of the semester. I actually care, and they know that I care about what they're saying. And that's different, again, from someone acting like they care or acting like they're listening. Lisa, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, I think that's right. Maybe we should open up to questions, but I think I discovered that I think this is feminist pedagogy, right? And to Stephan's point, I think that a real feminist classroom begins on the first day. It begins with the syllabus. It really requires you to set the stage in a different way. So while any one module can be feminist, and I can use feminist practices and pedagogy, it's you have to build it from the base.
Well, thank you so much. So we will have time for a Q&A session. Again, that was a very interesting presentation. But before we get to the Q&A session, we have another two panelists for today's session. I'm very excited to introduce Günseli Berik, who is a professor of economics at the University of Utah. Her research and teaching are in the fields of development economics, gender and development, as well as feminist economics. Her latest books are Gender Development and Globalization, Economics as If All People Mattered. And that was co-authored with Lourdes Beneria, I believe, and Maria Floro, and the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Economics, co-edited with our presenter today, Ebru Kongar. She serves as editor of the Journal of Feminist Economics and from 2010 to 2017, and worked on research papers for the ILO, UNDP, UNRISD, UN Women, and the World Bank. Our second presenter, or fourth actually, is Ebru Kongar, who is a professor of economics at Dickinson College. Her research focuses on the gender time use and labor market outcomes of macroeconomic development, such as deindustrialization, offshoring, and the Great Recession in the US economy. She is Associate Editor of Feminist Economics and Research Associate at the Gender Equality and the Economy Program of Levi Economics Institute of Bard College. It's been a long morning. Her latest co-edited volumes are the Routledge Handbook of Economics, which is co-edited with Günseli Berik, and Gender and Time Use in a Global Context, which is co-edited with Rachel Connolly. So before I mess up even more words, I'm going to hand it over to Günseli and Ebru.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And Ebru and I would like to thank Iris Buder and Association for Social Economics for inviting us and organizing this webinar. Our goal in this presentation is to clarify the difference between gender economics and feminist economics. And while economics of gender has been around for a while, at least as long as feminist economics has been around, gender economics is a new term, and it is the one that's gaining currency. Recently, there has been a proliferation of research activity under the label of gender economics. And also, and this is sort of paralleled the growing attention within the economics discipline, the profession as a whole, to gender inequality issues. And I guess this is undoubtedly in part due to the growing evidence of the toxic environment in workplaces, including, of course, the profession itself. And actually the scholars who identify as gender economists mention this as the sort of the motivating issue for them. So we believe it is timely to understand how gender economics differs from feminist economics. Now, let's consult Joyce Jacobson. She's, of course, the a former IAFE president, International Association for Feminist Economics, the main organization for our scholarship. And she has recently published this year, she has published a book, Advanced Introduction to Feminist Economics. And she also has published a textbook in 1994 by the title Economics of Gender. So let's consult her. And this is how she defines in her book as study of how gender differences lead to different economic outcomes as encapsulated in terms of standard economic measures such as earnings, income, wealth, poverty rates, hours of work, and time use. And now feminist economics encompasses gender economics, but is broader in that it is critical of the male biases in economic theory and methodology. So according to Jacobson, gender economics is a subset of feminist economics. However, there's another way to characterize or categorize gender economics, and that is as a field in mainstream economics. And this is how the contributing authors to a recent journal special issue on gender economics characterize gender economics. And this special issue was in the journal Oxford Review of Economic Policy, 2020. And so a field, but also given the pluralist embrace of feminist economics, gender economics also falls under feminist economics. However, I mean, we have to note that this sort of feeling or the sentiment is not necessarily mutual. For instance, this special issue of Oxford Review of Economic Policy has no engagement with works published in the journal Feminist Economics. And this has been, of course, a problem that has been noted by, on and off by many feminist economists, this sort of attitude or sort of a stance by gender economists towards feminist economics, neglecting the work that's already been published and available for everyone to make use of. So now, actually, Ebru, can we go back? Sorry, I have more to say on this. So what about the purple part then? Well, the purple part in the purple shaded area in this Venn diagram, of course, is distinct from mainstream economics, since much of feminist economics is actually critical of the mainstream. So now we refer to this scholarship depicted in the purple area as critical feminist economics. So, so feminist economics, therefore, is composed of gender economics and critical feminist economics. Now, critical feminist economists are not a homogeneous group, but we argue that their research shares the methodological foundation of the social provisioning approach, which was outlined by Marilyn Power in 2004. And this was the methodology that we emphasized in the recently published Handbook of Feminist Economics. there we asked, in that project, we asked the authors to evaluate scholarship in their respective topic areas from the methodological perspective of social provisioning approach. So now, as members of Association for Social Economics are well aware, social provisioning is a classical and not a neoclassical concept. The social in SBA highlights interdependence and cooperation among people in securing their livelihoods. And of course, there's also this recognition that the economy is embedded in society, and this SBA invites attention to historically specific analysis, and of course that analysis is attentive to social structures and agency that are differentiated by gender, race, class, and other socially assigned identities. So but the sort of these various strands of critical feminist economics, which we argued share the social provisioning methodology, these sort of date back to at least the 1970s, but perhaps much earlier as well. I mean, their roots are certainly much earlier. But these encompass institutional feminist economics, and from institutional feminist economics, the critical feminist economics borrows the importance of institutions, culture, and history in limiting, expanding people's ability to provide for themselves and their families. Then there's, of course, feminist political economy, which sort of borrows from radical political economy and emphasizes unequal power relations, not only in terms of class, but also race and gender, and emphasizes sort of the importance of social reproduction, which, of course, critical feminist economists sort of embrace that idea and include care work as an important part of provisioning activities. Then the other strand within critical feminist economics is feminist environmentalism and feminist ecological economics. And these are, of course, emphasizing the importance of a healthy environment for well-being and the parallels between care work and the environment as being neglected in of course, standard measures and the standard measures of well-being, such as the GDP, but also very important for social provisioning. And from Black feminist thought, critical feminist economics borrows the idea of the importance of centering the experiences of marginalized groups, as is the case in the gender and development literature that emphasizes attention to the low-income women and assessing development from their perspective. And then of course we have the latest on the block is sort of coming from Nancy Folbray, what she calls intersectional political economy, which she defines as a theoretical framework that can not only help explain inequalities based on gender, age, sexuality, but also address other dimensions of inequality with attention to their variation, complexity, articulation, and interaction. So these are essentially all, we believe, falling under the sort of the umbrella of critical feminist economics. Now, further, we believe that critical feminist economics is closely aligned with the goal of feminist economic scholarship, and at least as stated on the webpage of Feminist Economics, the journal, which is The goal is not only to develop more eliminating theories, but also to improve conditions of living for all children, women, and men. Now, this is a very inclusive statement, but it also includes not just sort of academic theory making, but also thinking about changing the world. And so inherent in that, or implicit in that, is, first of all, we have to have a broader notion of well-being that goes beyond the standard economic measures of well-being. We have to have an intersectional understanding of people's location and capabilities. And of course, we have to tackle the issue of reorganizing economies and societies in a way to in ways to expand the people's abilities to make a adequate living, and of course that means removing structural obstacles, institutional and structural obstacles. So this is a statement that is very much in sync with the critical feminist economic perspective.
To sort of highlight how the two approaches are different, how critical feminist scholarship is different from gender economics in approaching economic issues. We took two examples, and one of them is the gender earnings inequality, which I'll go over. So starting with gender economics, this is as a field in mainstream economics. What they do is they apply the choice theoretic framework of neoclassical economics to understanding the causes of gender earnings inequality. So we have the supply side and demand side explanations. And on the supply side, in the past, the emphasis used to be that women do not have as much human capital as men, thereby leading to gender earnings inequality. And in the US context, given that women's college graduation rates have been increasing, now this emphasis on women's choices in terms of educational attainment has shifted to women's choices of college majors and occupations. So the explanation being women are self-selecting into college majors that put them on a path to low-paying occupations, or they choose low-paying occupations because that's what they prefer. In analyzing gender earnings gap in high-paying occupations, the same framework applies, and in this case, the difference is attributed to choice over work schedules. The argument being that women trade off temporal flexibility for higher pay, while men are compensated for being willing to work long hours and with inflexible schedules. On the demand side, discrimination, of course, plays their role, and mainstream economics offers two theories of discrimination, which is due to prejudice or imperfect information. Becker's theory for taste for discrimination argues that the source of discrimination is this individual with a taste for discrimination. They are prejudiced against members of the group, and they are willing to pay to keep either physical or social distance from members of this group. Since they are willing to pay to keep this distance from the people they are prejudiced against, this makes them costly employers, in which case they can only exist in imperfectly competitive or concentrated industries. So the only thing we need to do to make sure they are eliminated from the market is to increase market competition. Statistical discrimination theory conceptualizes discrimination as profit maximizing employers' response to imperfect information about prospective employees. Because it is costly to acquire information about each applicant, they rely on either data or basically perception of group characteristics, applying group characteristics to individuals. In the past couple of decades, looking at the gender economics literature, Baker's taste for discrimination theory is now extended to open economies. So the argument is increasing import competition in concentrated industries is going to eliminate gender wage discrimination or discriminatory gender wage differentials in these industries. The other new thing in the past couple of decades is this consciously discriminatory person, Baker's discriminatory employer, now might have also unconscious bias, so might be unconsciously discriminating against people. The same thing applies to statistical discrimination as well. This now applies, this is now extended to include unconscious stereotyping of people. So how do we compare this to critical feminist economics approach? There's a long history in critical feminist economics scholarship criticizing treating discrimination as residual. As Lefebvre quoted here, outright discrimination represents only the tip of a larger iceberg that has frozen women into economic disadvantage. So in this perspective, in the wage equation that controls for gender differences in productivity-related characteristics, are all bearers of discrimination in a way because they reflect gender norms that disadvantage women's ability to provide for themselves and their families. This literature also argues that construction of labor markets are in a way to maintain patriarchal and capitalist interests. For instance, long employment hours, short school days, part-year school calendar, absence of paid family leave, and other work-life policies are all patriarchal constructs. These institutional constraints in turn enforce gender division of unpaid work and persistence of gender earnings inequality. As Günseli argued earlier, incorporating care work into economic analysis is one of the starting points of feminist economic methodology. The way Power puts it is rather than being shoehorned in as an afterthought. And when we look at care work, we see that critical feminist economists argue that care work is undervalued in market societies, therefore contributing to the gender earnings gap. Historical exclusion of housekeepers, cleaners, nannies, and caregivers from protections of federal labor law is also a social construct, and predominance of immigrant and racialized women in these occupations is, of course, not a coincidence given the historical inequalities. So all of these reflect gendered and racialized social construction of markets and state institutions that constrain women's capabilities and contribute to the gender earnings gap. I think I'll pass this on to you now, Günseli.
Yes, the second area that we want to sort of highlight in this presentation, second area of sort of divergence between gender economics and critical feminist economics, is this notion of smart economics. And this has, of course, appeared on the world stage in a sort of international policy-oriented scholarship in the early in this millennium. And it consists of, its basic idea is to emphasize the efficiency case for eliminating gender inequality. And I guess the question that is being tackled here is also how to achieve gender equality. And so basically the proponents of smart economics, that kind of basically there are a lot of gains to be made from reducing inequality, are emphasizing growth, economic growth, and increasing women's paid work participation as the means to achieve gender equality. Really not much else. And so liberation will take place within the existing structures of capitalism, essentially. And in their analysis, they tend to focus on selective dimensions of gender inequality. So women's labor force participation is important. Women as entrepreneurs, training and education for women is important. Removing institutional constraints, such that constrain equal opportunity, is also important, but there's a glaring absence of attention to gender wage inequality, for example. Does reducing gender wage inequality also promote growth? Silence on this. And they disregard the adverse effects of the conditionality, the macroeconomic conditionalities that these institutions, IMF and the World Bank, typically impose, and they continue to impose, although they're softened around the edges, but they're not gone away. And austerity, of course, and the decades of austerity and the harmful effects of that are ignored as well. Now, if we turn to the critical feminist economics, I mean, of course, there's a sort of a very large literature here, but at least, basically this approach emphasizes tackling the macroeconomic environment within which the sort of gender inequality issues are to be raised. So basically, that to reduce gender equality, there needs to be expansionary demand side policies and also interventions that kind of dismantle the structures that keep an economy as a low wage, low productivity kind of a machine. And and of course, you can see that this is sort of a lot of this literature is focused on low income developing countries. And so the focus is, and as is the policy prescription by the World Bank and the IMF. So this approach also emphasizes attention to diversity among women, whereas the gender economics approaches in this discourse, at least, is homogenizes women, and with the women of smart economics are a homogeneous group. And gender critical feminist economics also is attentive to exploitative working conditions, not just the wages, the low wages that fuel growth, but also the exploitative working conditions, which again, gender economics is absent on that score as well. And the context of extreme and rising wealth inequality, which of course is going to deprive economies of resources to, improve well-being overall, but also move towards gender equality. So in conclusion, the stock taking by our contributors to the Handbook of Feminist Economics basically highlighted the broader scope of economic analysis, feminist economic analysis, and broadening from income and earnings inequalities, resource inequalities in general, to capabilities, outcomes, well-being outcomes of people. The contributors also highlighted the important strides made in conceptualization and measurement of care work, important feminist research on gender and macroeconomics, and issues that were on the margins, have moved closer to the center: intersectionality, clearly, ecological feminist economics, feminist degrowth, and violence against women being some of the important topics here. So overall, basically, this research generated new knowledge for the changing world economy. And of course, this critical feminist economic scholarship has both explanatory and transformative power, we argue, to improve the lives of all. So we hope that that future research in these various strands of critical feminist economics will take advantage of synergies between the different strands of hyphenated feminist economic scholarship, as well as moving on their own tracks. Okay. Are we done? Okay, great. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much. We have time, so great talks by both presenting groups. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We do have about 20 minutes for a Q&A session. If people would like to ask questions, please either do the raise your hand feature or type out your questions in chat. And to get us started, I will ask a question because I was curious about Stephan and Lisa. Have there been any implementation challenges for this type of teaching approach? And do you have any tips for us as instructors for such a project?
Lisa, do you want to go first?
Well, I think for me, the biggest implementation challenge is really it's gonna show up that I don't cover as much information, so that'll show up at the end for me, which is really in the theory of the firm. And so, I think it would be really hard to do if I were an untenured assistant professor and I had to explain that, to my department that, oh, I didn't get to oligopoly. Oh, well, sorry, so that's hard. And then, in terms of student resistance, I didn't have much at all. I think students were really engaged and very much enjoyed the process, really liked the cooperative learning activities, really liked to go in depth. And I feel like they ended up really at some level at that commitment stage. Stephan, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, like one of your colleagues talked about the commitment stage of Perry's learning, but maybe unwittingly they were there and maybe didn't know they were even there. But I thought it was great.
Yeah, I'll just say that there were implementation challenges that are opening up this project for me. I thought I would look up what feminist pedagogy and economics is, apply it with a minimum wage module, and then publish it as a publication. Like, hey guys, everyone can do this. What I discovered is the literature is very thin. So one of the biggest implementation challenges, my own training in critical pedagogies, right? I don't have any. I'm self-teaching, and working with Lisa on this. This literature is extremely marginalized, just like we heard in the last presentation. Critical feminist pedagogies is extremely marginalized. If you want to do a nudge, half the room reads an article where it's a male CEO, half the room reads an article with a female CEO. How does that improve DEI outcomes? This project is opening up for me. I can imagine another framework listing similar to the Günseli and Ebru DEI approaches and critical feminist approaches. It is very difficult to do it in Econ 101. And so I'll end by saying I'm really excited to talk to anyone in this group that's willing to, and I'm sure Lisa feels the same way. Please tell me about what feminist pedagogy and economics means to you. What have you tried? What resources have you used? I want to keep working on this. So maybe the next stage on this will be an intellectual history of feminist pedagogy in economics. What are those original articles? Who followed up on it? And why? So interviewing those people saying, you published this in the 90s, what happened?
All right, thank you so much. Any other further questions, thoughts, comments? So if I might as well. I do have an additional question for Günseli and Ebru. So you talked about the notion of the intersectional political economy, right? Race and gender and things like that. Has there been much done lately that you've seen? Because as Stephan just pointed out, right, there's a lack of the literature on this. What are you seeing with regards to what you are studying as well as what is being written on?
Ebru, you want to tackle this?
In terms of intersectionality, there are definitely some excellent contributions by scholars, including the presenter on this call. But I guess one of the things they would say first and foremost would be how there is more need to do more of this, which of course is constrained by our training in quantitative methodologies, that we don't have enough big samples to be able to examine some questions. Nina Banks, for instance, in the handbook, talks about how she had to train herself to be able to do archival research, interviews, so on and so forth, to recover the economic ideas of Sadie Alexander. There has been special issues of feminist economics that look at caste, class, race, so on and so forth, intersectionality. But she does find that there has been little movement towards this type of research in the field. So certainly something we'd like to see more of.
Yeah, I think, I agree. But I also think that, so Stephan, you mentioned that you're a stratification economist, right? And just like with that literature, right? Because I also dive into it myself, and it's sparse, right? It is just few and far between, and it's also this notion of working in a silo in that way, because if we don't reach out and do this cross-disciplinary research, we often miss the key elements of addressing health disparities, racial and ethnic and gender disparities and things like that. So I think we can all learn from this. It's not just, is it this, not the silo approach, and this is just my humble opinion, but we see this as stratification economics, clearly with feminist economics literature, right? The lack of intersectionality and things like that. So Stephan, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just a follow-up. I really resonated with Günseli and Ebru's the challenge that we have. So there are a very small number of stratification economists producing lots of papers. And then there's the giant mainstream that if just on a whim, one of them said, oh, great, let's write a paper on stratification economics, that could be 50% or more of the papers in stratification economics. So there's this need to define, based on the literature, not our own whims, but based on the literature, what is critical feminist pedagogies? Are you engaging with feminist theory, critical feminist thought? It's similar with stratification economics.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we have a few more raised hands, so I apologize in advance for if I butcher your name. So we'll go first with the first hand that was raised, with this Handi Tuguru.
Thank you. It's Hande.
Hande, okay.
I'll turn my video on too. Hi, friends, and Ebru and Günseli, my teachers, both of them. So I am coming in from an absolutely different angle. I'm not an academician. So I think how I can identify myself is a popular education person who gone through PhD, economics PhD, but really dived into social justice work for the last 15 years. And So it's a different world. I mean, I don't even know how to, your work is amazing. Your trenches are so hard. Where you're at is so hard because you are dealing with incredibly strong institutional resistance, right? So outside, you know, currently I'm working with native groups in Great Basin and trying to create models for female leadership. So these will be in reservations. I mean, this is in Navajo reservation. So Lisa and Stephan, you know, what you have been doing, I think, phenomenal. And Ebru and Günseli, the way you explain critical feminist approach is, there are so many connections from critical feminist approach and indigenous women's approach, but there's still incredible gaps between them. So I am now learning a lot about, you know, in the indigenous women's approach, who are not even identifying as feminists, as you may assume, right? Like there's a different, it's very close to care work, environmentalist, ecological constructs in your world. So, and the whole approach, you know, whole worldview is different. The whole worldview is, you know, Navajo way, Diné way, Shoshone way, Paiute way. So what I'm trying to say is I learned a lot today. At the same time, so maybe I step back, and sorry to take a lot of time, but when I go to, it's like the Lisa and Stephan is trying to change the way it's being done, right? It's being taught. The conversations are so different, like the method and methodology of being together in an indigenous group versus group like this, right? Nothing right or wrong, nothing right or wrong. It's so different. So, but I caught the glimpse of it in both presentations. Like there are some things I want to take from your amazing works, you know, all these years you have been doing, but I don't know yet what. Maybe it's a one-on-one conversation. I just wanted to share it. It's just, I am having difficulty with coming from this, where you are at, and trying to do the work. So does it make sense? It's like it's a comment. It's not even a question. Sorry for taking a lot of time. Just feels good to see all of you.
Well, no, thank you. I think those are valuable insights that you bring up. So thank you so much. Next we have Paul. Do you want to ask your question or comment?
Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm with Ebru, and I'm from Dickinson College. Thank you so much for the talk today. I actually had a couple of questions for Günseli and Ebru. So I come from a very neoclassical background, and I've been sort of working on a bit of intersection of macro and gender economics recently. And would you say that, for example, if you think about sort of from neoclassical perspective, people started adding home production as explicitly in part of utility functions, then would you say that that's sort of bridging the gap between, you know, mainstream economics versus feminist economics to actually capture that, to sort of bridge the gap between that? And also, it seems to me that really trying to identify these social norm parameters, explicitly identifying social norm parameters seems to be important. And I wonder what you guys thought about explicitly modeling social norm parameters in the neoclassical framework, and if that would actually be a response to sort of bring the two fields together a little more, and or yeah, I wonder what you guys thought about that.
Günseli, did you want to go first?
I mean, I guess including utility function or unpaid work as in the utility function, that's what you said, right? I mean, again, if we are using the same, neoclassical apparatus of, optimization, I mean, I think it just stays within the gender economics, under the gender economics umbrella. I mean, obviously, there's recognition of gender or disproportionate work, unpaid work by women. So recognition of that. But I mean, we would have to see, right, how to what extent this model is going to take into account the constraints that are, beyond the price and, income or whatever the standard, constrained optimization constraints, which are limiting. So it's all a story that becomes very incomplete, I think. And similarly with gender norms, I mean, I don't know how they could be modeled, but again, it's like you're confining it within that neoclassical apparatus. And that's, I think, the difficulty here.
So thank you for your response, Günseli. So following up on that, it seems to me that the problem or the kind of moving forward, the limitation lies on what are the potential macro data that can actually capture these things, like, so for example, home production. I think people in gender economics usually identify that by looking at labor hours, labor hours done at home. So if home production hours are reported well in the macro data, then maybe that's like one way to capture these social norm parameters. It could be a proxy of it, but it seems to me that that's sort of the statistical discrimination, perhaps, that you guys were touching on, that macro data is not really comprehensive enough to capture these things. But yeah, thank you so much for your response.
All right, so thank you again. We are now, so let's go with Ritesh. Hey, Ritesh. He's just one of our students. So Ritesh, please go ahead and ask your question or provide your comment.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Berik. So my question is to Günseli and Ebru. So when you talked about the critical feminist approach, you mentioned that growth and increasing women's paid work participation will achieve gender inequality. What I wanted to ask is, how important do you think is females' political participation in achieving the gender equality?
I mean, absolutely important, of course, political participation as kind of empowerment, as an indicator of empowerment, absolutely important. But, you know, elected office, of course, is one metric, right, of political participation, but also movements, you know, to what extent, women have voice, if we're talking about women here, have voice, women of different groups have voice in, and expressing their sort of demands that can be heard at the electoral level is another. So, I mean, you can have different sort of political empowerment metrics here. And I would say the collective empowerment metric is important to consider. So, I mean, there's always a tendency to rely on the percent female among elected representatives, for example, to kind of classify countries of, oh, there's more voice here and, in this country versus that. But, that's a bit incomplete, so do you need a more contextual analysis to understand if voice of a broader group of women gets heard at the electoral level? I don't know if
okay. Well, no, absolutely it does. The reason I ask is because I had come across a few literature that talks that when women are in leadership position or in general, their priorities are different, and they tend to focus on policies that addresses women's concerns and need better. So I was just kind of curious that in critical feminist approach, we are talking about getting gender inequality through like hearing about demand side policies and interventions. So if there are still male leaders, or if there are still biases in the political environment, are those concerns, or what is needed to be done to gain gender equality, are those issues still going to be heard by the policy making body? That's what I was kind of concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, you probably know that, you know, just having women in elected office doesn't mean that they're going to be feminist voices, right? So there's, I mean, and depends on country, it depends on the, you know, how democratic the country's structure is. If it's authoritarian, obviously having more women is just not going to make any difference, right? And how they got to those positions is also kind of important. You know, is it through family affiliation that they're elected, sitting in elected office, right? So those are the important issues. But in general, I mean, in more democratic context, it appears to be that having more women representatives actually does translate into more demands and more demand side macroeconomic sort of policy support. I mean, as we see in the, you know, Build Back Better kind of contingents, at least in the Democratic Party in the US, right? So they're kind of highly supportive of infrastructure, social care infrastructure. So anyway, but I'm taking a lot of time, so I'll stop.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much.
Any other final comments or follow-up questions? Oh, sorry, I see it. I got it. Ebru, go ahead.
I actually did have comments to people who asked questions, but I'll skip that. And I have a question for Lisa and Stephan. Not a question, first a comment. Have you seen the syllabi that we gathered as IFE on feminist economics courses? And I was wondering if, since these are members of IFE, people who identify as feminist economists, I wonder if you go through their syllabi, you can identify the pedagogies they use, like class participation, group work, so on and so forth. Or even, since the names are on the syllabi, you can even create a survey asking them the pedagogies they use in the classroom. That's the other thing is Zohre Emami made a presentation at the ICAPE conference a few years back about teaching pedagogy, updating that valuing us all book. I don't know if she published it anywhere, but anyway, that may be a resource. I have a question. I do try to implement feminist pedagogies, and I would like a copy of our PowerPoint slideshow if possible at some point. But I also have always wondered, so some of the empowering pedagogies in the classroom are almost designed with a professor who is a professor in mind, and that professor is sort of used to be typically a member of a dominant group who needs to give power away rather than claim it in the classroom. You know, when you apply for teaching positions, progressive places that's teaching oriented usually ask for a teaching statement, and you talk about inclusive pedagogies, but in the same time, if you're an applicant struggling, applying as a marginalized member, struggling to claim authority in the classroom, I think that differs in our ability to apply some pedagogies. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
That's fascinating. Well, first of all, I want to say, yeah, the Feminist Economics Pedagogy site with the uploaded syllabuses is a fascinating and really important resource that I think I'll speak for Stephan, we really appreciate. It's fantastic. I think that's really interesting, your point about, you know, where the professor stands and their initial power. That's a really interesting comment, you know, so either taking or giving away authority. Your comment is really interesting to me. I haven't thought about it much, but I think you're right. That's going to have to be something we consider when we think about feminist pedagogy. Yeah.
Dennis Peterson, I think, has a comment. Hi, Jen.
Yeah, I wanted to apologize for being late and missing some of the first presentation, but I did just want to say how delighted I was to see your work with DFINC and those learning outcomes. And I think I can say I've found that very helpful. Where I teach, we are given a template for our syllabi. And so in my case, the impact is, I mean, it's subtle. I mean, it's not something you're going to see, you know, in a syllabi, but in terms of, particularly given the student body that I teach and the place that I teach at Cal State Fresno, having students relate things to their own lives is a very, not only a powerful strategy, but almost a completely necessary strategy for, I think, economics classes to resonate. So I really, I look forward to hearing more about and reading more about your work. I think it's really great. And everyone, Günseli, of course, you know, your work is always great. And I'm enjoying the handbook that you did very much. So thank you.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Janice. Sorry, I had to try to fix my screen where I was. So thank you, Ebru, for filling in for me there. Günseli, did you have another comment or?
Well, actually, I had many thoughts in mind, but let me just say a few things. I mean, I think in regard to Hande's question, I mean, I think Stephen and Lisa's presentation really, I think, shows the way for you, Hande, because it's really breaks down that learning process and kind of reaching out to the academic, from the academic to the student, I guess. But also, you know, you have to, of course, have the arrow running from the student to the, or the, you know, the native communities in this case, to the academic as well, and that's of course a huge challenge. Now, I mean, the silo problem, I think that Stephen mentioned that, and I just find that to be an awful bottleneck to many good things that we could all do in the sort of being critical, you know, whether from pedagogy perspective or just, you know, academic content perspective. I mean, you mentioned, you know, the stratification economics. So clearly we could have included that under our, you know, contributors to or strands of feminist economics, but the research is so sparse there, and you just, you know, here and there, very few kind of publications, but clearly we, as you know, others in that, you know, under the umbrella of critical feminist economics, have to you know engage with that literature, and because otherwise, you know, we really can't move forward, whether it's intersectionality issues or just making a difference politically. I mean, I found that in my, you know, earlier, kind of a few years ago, I was engaged in sort of environmental metrics, and sort of I found myself totally, you know, the silo nature of, you know, there's feminist economics here, and then there is the ecological economics here, and they're not really talking to each other, and I have to kind of understand the concerns of each group, et cetera, but making an argument for unity around, or just, you know, engaging with each other. So I just, but then, you know, there are practical issues. You know, you can't be like a generalist. I mean, I considered myself at this point a generalist, but you know, people expect you to kind of specialize, right? And to specialize, there's obviously a time constraint and how much you can kind of venture out and read in different disciplines while you're also teaching and trying to improve your teaching pedagogy and your publishing, etc. So there are real practical constraints here on like what is going to be the priority here. But anyway, so some thoughts.
I just had a quick thought about Ebru's comment, which I really appreciated in terms of the positionality of the instructor. And I do want to think about that. And I think we should incorporate that when we're thinking about a feminist classroom. One of the things that I do proactively and explicit with students, I tell them that that's what I'm doing, is that I'm also trying to provide a model for them of I'm a white Latino, but a white person who is engaging in anti-racism, a man who is engaging in feminism. So part of it, I agree that I don't think it's enough to just share the mic. I mean, you also, people in positions of privilege have to do more than just listen, or, so I say, I'm just trying to give the model to my students who are primarily white, primarily wealthy, give them a model of what class solidarity looks like, those things, yeah.
Yes, great points to bring up. So any final thoughts or conclusions from anybody? Again, I want to thank everybody, all our panelists, also, of course, the Association for Social Economics that brought together this Feminist Economics Scholarship and Teaching webinar. Everybody was fantastic, and I look forward to reading your work in the future. So again, this will be recorded and posted to ASE YouTube channel. So that should be sent out via email to everybody in the next coming days. So again, thank you so much. Appreciate you all being here, and hope everybody has a great rest of the day and stay safe.
Thank you, Iris.
Thanks all.
Thank you.